I'm speaking to you for the chief whip here, as well as myself. When I say for the benefit of those who allowed themselves to get carried away by the gossip of the last 2 days, I know what's going on. I am going on. Your government is going on. And let me give you some useful advice. To the plotters and defeatists, I say to them, climb into bed, pull the blankets over their heads, and not hinder the rest of us who have a job to do. We'll tell them when it's safe to come out. I could see you've got through it there, Michael. You bravely got through it. I think you actually distracted me in that. So for the audience still remaining, firstly, well done, including yourself there, Michael. I'm surprised you didn't reach for the exit button there. So yeah, and if you've not, if you are still here and you haven't reached for the sick bucket, as you bravely continued listening to my woeful impression of Howard Wilson. Sadly, I don't come with prop guys. I couldn't sport a Macintosh coat or smoking pipe, so you have to make do with that. So yes, that was a speech delivered by then Prime Minister Howard Wilson at a May Day rally packed with Labour and trade union delegates in 1969. Now, for some of our audience, a bit confused now, thinking, hang on, I thought we're here to talk about the SDP. Don't worry, we are not here to talk about Howard Wilson, although he will play quite a crucial part in this story. But the subject, the individual in question that Howard Wilson was hinting in an inquiry in that speech, would end up playing a very significant and important role, both in the Labour Party's direction or perhaps misdirection, helping form the SDP, and was one of the most important players in re-establishing the three-party politics, or 2.5-party politics if you're of that persuasion or a little bit cynical, or even setting the stone of the multi-party democracy that we see today. And this person was Roy Jenkins, who, of course, in 1969 was not in the SDP, as it hadn't existed yet, but was at the time Labour's Chancellor, second only to Howard Wilson. And I think we could both agree, we just spoke off air, Michael, I think we could both agree that if you're invited to his dinner party, you'd never be short on wine. But of course, you're a teetotaler, Michael, so I'd be more than happy to finish off your glasses. That would be a very heavy evening with good old Roy. Hello, my name is Andy, and with me today is Councillor Michael Mullaney, who is a familiar face on the channel. And before Michael gets a little bit nervous, thinking he's basically just joined a one-man theatre play, I will be handing over to Michael very shortly. But if you're new to the channel, I often do politics, political history, and today is the first of a 3-part series on the history of the SDP. So, Michael, welcome again, and thank you for doing this with me. And before I ask you a question that I've got written down here regarding that speech, and before we sort of begin to dive into this, to the history of the SDP, firstly, I think it might be a good jumping off point if we perhaps explain the format of the series. Like I said, it's history of the SDP, which would later become the Alliance. And I think we both agreed that the reason for doing this is that, one, it's a fascinating period of time in British politics, but also it's actually quite relevant today, is it not?
Yes. So I think the reason why I was interested in doing this particularly now is I think we had a 2-party system in Britain, Labour-Tory 2-party system, that basically got established about 1924 and carried on for a century. There's this big battle in the early to mid-1920s between the Liberal Party and the Labour Party over who will be the main challenger to the Conservatives. The Liberal Party splits after World War I. Part of the party goes with Herbert Asquith. Part of the party goes with David Lloyd George, who's been in coalition with the Conservatives. They run as 2 separate parties in 1922, the Asquithian Liberals and the Lloyd George Liberals. That allows Labour to sneak in and get second place. There's a big battle in the 1923 election when they come back together again. Lloyd George and Asquith reunite. They come back together as one party, and they have a very popular message in that election, which is about free trade, which is an old Liberal clarion call. It's what helped the Liberals win the 1906 election.
A debate that's now been settled today.
Indeed. Well, exactly. And free trade and tariffs and all the rest of it is now a very up-to-date with all the Trump business issue. But at the time they were running against Baldwin, who was Stanley Baldwin, the Tory, was looking at putting tariffs on. And so they reunite, they have a popular, distinctive message, and it's a really close fight between Labour and the Liberals in 1923. The Labour Party get 30% of the vote, the Liberals get 29%. There's 191 seats for Labour and 59 for the Liberals. Basically, Labour just edge out. They get into government, the Liberals get into opposition. The government collapses after a short period, but we then enter this period of polarisation where the Liberal Party falls back to 40 seats in 1924. And then basically for a century, we have this Labour-Tory battle. Although during that period, there are various points where it looks like it might be challenged. Now, the thing now is we are now really seeing, after 100 years, the breakup of that two-party system. In the general election in 2024, the Liberal Democrats got 72 seats. That's the most seats the party's won since that election in 1923. The Conservative Party has its lowest number of seats ever, lower than 1906, lower than 1945, lower than 1997. You see the Reform Party rising as well in votes, although not so much in seats last general election. Then last year's local elections, the top two parties are Reform and Lib Dems in terms of seats won, not Labour or the Tories. And in by-elections in the last year, it's again Reform and the Lib Dems who have won the most by-elections. Labour and Tories have been making quite heavy losses. And you can now see from the polling that you've got a situation where it's likely to be a local elections this year where again Reform and the Lib Dems and probably the Greens do quite well, and Labour and the Tories struggle. And then the Welsh Parliament, the Scottish Parliament, where it's likely to be the Nationalists versus Reform, possibly Labour in Scotland. So we're seeing the breakdown of that two-party system. And I thought what would be good at the moment is to look back at the one time between 1924 and 2024 when it looked like actually that two-party system could be breaking and coming to an end, and looking at the story of that challenged the two-party system, which came close to replacing it with the formation of the SDP. And so what we were basically going to do was a three-part series that would firstly look at the formation of the SDP, which is what this episode was looking at. And you obviously allude to the divisions within the Labour Party, which is one of the substantial reasons why we see the formation of the SDP. So part one will basically look at how did the SDP come about? Why did this party that challenged the two-party system emerge? Part two will look at the sort of peak strength of the SDP in the early 80s and how it nearly replaces one of the two main parties. And then part three will look at why in the end it didn't succeed, although it did make quite an impact. So it should be an interesting three-part look at the SDP. And again, for those who are keen on Liberal Party history, it's a big part of the party's history because obviously we're Liberal Democrats, because the merger of the Liberal Party and the SDP is what brought about the Liberal Democrats. So I'll hand over to you to your question then on Harold Wilson.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. So I think to understand the history of the SDP, we kind of need to understand the history of the Labour Party. But before I ask you that question, so I opened it with Harold Wilson's speech. Are you familiar with this speech at all, Michael? And perhaps could you explain what prompted Harold Wilson to make that speech at a May Day rally? You know, because it's quite a defensive speech. Obviously, for people who know Harold Wilson, he was a very witty man. He was able to use charm offensive to sort of diffuse a lot of speculation and rumours. Perhaps explain, you know, why did Harold Wilson have to go in on the defence with that speech, and why did it particularly tie to Roy Jenkins? And perhaps, Michael, perhaps you can expand to our audience and viewers Britain's two-party, sort of natural two-party system. It's sort of it's quite embedded in British political culture, and we've only really seen we had three parties. So we've had the Conservative Party, the Labour Party, but before that there was the Liberal Party. But still, there's always been a sort of natural two-party system. And I also think, Michael, that it can't be exaggerated that the Conservative Party is, even though the Conservative Party has been a partner in this two-party system, really you could almost call British politics a 1.5 party system, in that the Conservative Party has always been the natural party of government. And I think it might be quite telling that as we start exploring the story of the Labour Party and the Conservatives' traditional adversary, the Liberal Party, I think a lot of it has to do with that these were both political parties that often built a reputation of being rather fractured and had a lot of divisions within those political parties.
So the Conservative Party dominated British politics. It was a two-party system. The Tory Party dominated British politics for most of the 20th century. And they used to say that the secret weapon of the Conservative Party was loyalty and unity, that they stayed together as a cohesive party. And what you see with the radical parties in British politics, such as the Liberal Party and then Labour, is they do have a tendency to split and to have factions. Obviously, the Liberal Party, a large part of its downfall is obviously the divisions in World War I between the Asquithian and Lloyd George Liberals. That partly does damage to the party and allows Labour to come in and move ahead of them. And then the real decline, when the party really sharply declines in the early 30s, with the divisions between the National Liberals and the continuing Liberals, and the Liberals are going with the Conservatives. You see a similar thing in the Labour Party. There's clearly factions within the Labour Party, and what Wilson is alluding to there is the factions within the Labour Party. The Conservative Party, part of its problem is it has become an ideological party. Until 1997, every single leader of the Conservative Party of the 20th century became Prime Minister. The only one that didn't was Austin Chamberlain, but he is removed. He basically is leader of the Conservative Party when Lloyd George is leader of a Conservative-dominated government. So in effect, it is still a Conservative government. He's just not the Prime Minister. Lloyd George is.
Short end of the stick there, didn't he?
That's part of their success. And then obviously the divisions, which we've seen particularly over Europe in recent years, and then with reform, it's part of the reason why the Conservative Party now is at risk, because that unity that used to hold the Conservative Party together has very much declined. But Labour is very much a factional party, which is one of the reasons why it's often out of power in the 20th century, even though it's the second party. And what you see with Harold Wilson there is him obviously referring to people who are dissenting against him and disagreeing with him. Now, there's an often used phrase from Michael Heseltine about he who wields the knife never wears the crown, which is about basically says whoever challenges the leader doesn't actually get on to become leader, so you shouldn't do it. And this has become almost a sort of political truism. Everyone is obviously drags it out, and it's often said, oh, you can't challenge that. It's being talked about with Starmer now. You can't challenge if you're the one that tries to stab Starmer and take over, you'll lose out because of it. Now, Heseltine was right with what he said, because he removes Thatcher by getting enough votes to stop her getting a majority, but he loses to John Major, and in a lot of ways that fight is actually what leads to the factionalism within the Tory party over Europe. The sort of fallout of the Thatcher removal causes a lot of the problems in the Tory party. Of course, the irony was that Thatcher had become leader herself by removing Ted Heath. And if we go and look at Harold Wilson is talking about loyalty within the Labour Party and is talking about challenges to his leadership. But it should be remembered that Harold Wilson in 1960 challenges Hugh Gaitskell for the leader of the Labour Party. There's huge divisions within the Labour Party in 1960. And Harold Wilson challenges him for the leadership. Now, he loses by 2-1, but when Hugh Gaitskell dies in early 1963, Harold Wilson manages to get elected leader of the Labour Party, despite having challenged Hugh Gaitskell a couple of years earlier.
Yeah.
It's quite a surprise that he wins the leadership, because he was seen as being on the left of the Labour Party. Now, there's an argument that Wilson had sort of moved from that position some years earlier, but he's seen by some still as being on the left of the Labour Party. And he's quite lucky to win the leadership election, because it's generally assumed the Parliamentary Labour Party will vote for a right-wing leader. But he has two people that stand against him. He has George Brown and he has Jim Callaghan, both sort of from the right. And
of course, Harold Wilson, in the case of 1962, he himself was involved in a leadership challenge, but he was challenging. He was the challenger. He was actually challenging the leadership as opposed to the one being challenged.
In 1962, Howard Wilson challenges George Brown for deputy leadership of the Labour Party, and George Brown beats him. But a year later, Howard Wilson gets elected leader of the Labour Party, beats George Brown. Basically, I think because there's a lot of reservation amongst Labour MPs not to vote George Brown because he is a very serious alcoholic, and there's a number of slightly embarrassing incidents involving him when he's drunk, and they sort of say it's better not to have him as leader of the Labour Party. So they elect Howard Wilson. So Wilson himself...
unpredictability of him, wasn't there?
Indeed. But Wilson himself has been involved in a lot of internal factionalism within the Labour Party. So he's complaining about the Jenkinsites challenging him, but obviously he himself wasn't immune from that factionalism. He'd resigned from the Labour government in 1950 over charges for NHS dental and eye charges. Basically because he'd fell out with Gaitskell. But a lot of the divisions within the Labour Party in the 60s are an overhang of the Gaitskell divisions with the left of the Labour Party. And so people like Roy Jenkins and Bill Rogers were close associates of Hugh Gaitskell. And in fact, when the moves against Hugh Gaitskell start in 1960, Bill Rogers, who's one of the four founders of the SDP, forms the Campaign for Democratic Socialism, which is a sort of right-wing group within the Labour Party grassroots.
Yeah. And I think, again, for audiences who are probably not so familiar with the Labour Party as well, the reason I'm probably thinking, why is the Jenkinites, the Hugh Gaitskell? I think a lot of it, I think would be fair to say, Michael, is that a lot of it came in its early formation. Before then, you had the independent Labour Party, but there was a lot of other socialist, trade union affiliated parties, social democrats, various left fractions. And I think they realised at the time, which formed the Labour Party, is that, look, we are going to win if we keep splitting, creating divisions, competing against ourselves. We need to create a united party. And I think really by the turn of the sort of 50s and 60s, this really began to upend itself. The very thing that created the Labour Party, these mixture of social democrats, socialists, trade unionists, possibly even Marxists within those fractions, really began to uproot itself, didn't it, by the 1960s? And I think perhaps that sort of adds a little bit more colour to this sort of conversation, really.
Yeah, the Labour Party is very much a factional party. And so in the 50s and 60s, you had this sort of battles between the Gaitskellites and, until he died in 1960, the Bevanites and Iron Bevan, who was sort of on the left wing of the Labour Party. And so you have disagreements over things like nuclear disarmament. The Labour Party conference in 1960 votes for unilateral nuclear disarmament. And Hugh Gaitskell says, I'll fight again to save the party I love. And really there's this sort of factional row between the left and the right over these issues. And also nationalisation. Gaitskell talks about getting rid of Clause 4, which is the part of the Labour Party constitution which commits it to the nationalisation of industry.
It's
one of the big divisions between the left and the right of the Labour Party is after the sort of Attlee government carries out a series of nationalisations, the right wing of the party basically says, well, that's enough really. We don't need to take any more the economy into public ownership. The left, on the other hand, are still pressurising for more nationalisation of industries. Gaitskell doesn't remove Clause 4. Of course, famously, Tony Blair later in 1995 rewrites Clause 4 and gets rid of that commitment to nationalisation from the Labour Party. But it's one of those divisions. So what you have within the Labour Party is a factional, divided party. It's divided over things like nuclear weapons. It's divided over issues like nationalisation. It's also divided over Europe, which comes to be one of the real focal points for division between the left and the right of the Labour Party.
And I think this issue over Europe, an issue that still continues to dominate certain political parties today, it's something, we see Labour as quite a pro-European party today, but it was never the case, as you're alluding to, Michael. And I suppose back in Labour in 1960s, 1970s, there was probably a case made by figures from from the moderates, from the Labour right, particularly from Roy Jenkins, that Howard Wilson had rather opportunistically decided to oppose Edward Heath's application, despite having wanted to apply for European entry under the last Wilson administration, which I imagine sat rather uncomfortably and was probably seen, I suppose, really adds to sort of Wilson's character, this kind of, sly, suspicious, cunning, sort of plays on both sides. I imagine that probably only further added that sort of alien, and also just a sense of fatigue and malaise and of just sort of a lack of leadership and a lack of strong convictions. And I suppose this issue, when it comes to Europe and the very sort of, I suppose really the very tribal nature that was being made within the Labour Party over the issue of Europe, of European cooperation, probably only continued to frustrate the matter more over time, and only further tested their loyalties and intensified their suspicions within the Labour Party.
So the European community, the European Economic Community, is formed in 1957 with 6 countries initially, and there's various applications to join from Britain over the years. Belatedly, we don't get to join. And then eventually when Ted Heath gets in 1970, he manages to put in an application for Britain to join the European Economic Community, which is accepted. And there's a series of votes in Parliament on this. And the Labour Party official line is to oppose membership of the European Common Market, even though actually the party had been in favour of it previously.
Yeah.
And basically, our view of the left wing of the Labour Party is that the European community is a capitalist club. It's all about, it's
a great cabal, a capitalist plot. Yeah.
Inventing socialism in one country, and we won't be able to have a socialist economy if we're part of this capitalist organisation. The right, on the other hand, see it as much more of an internationalist. Although even there's a division between a sort of more internationalist right, such as Roy Jenkins, who want to join, and others like Jim Callaghan, who are perhaps a bit more sceptical and perhaps take a bit more of a sort of British nationalist view of being
more conservative on Europe.
So being less keen. But what you see in 1971 is a big rebellion of 69 Labour MPs who vote against the party whip. So Howard Wilson says, you've got to vote against joining the common market, even though the party had been in favour of it a few years earlier. These 69 MPs, led by Roy Jenkins, say, no, we're going to vote in favour of it, and it means that the vote gets through. If they hadn't have rebelled, then there were enough Conservatives within the Ted Heath's party, Enoch Powell and various others, who were voting against the common market, that it wouldn't have gone through.
Equally, it makes figures on the Labour left and figures like Michael Foot and Tony Benn, it makes hard to ignore, and it only adds to the tribalism when you've got people like Roy Jenkins, who, again, with his prudent stewardship as Chancellor, who was quite austere in a lot of ways during his time as Chancellor. It makes the concept for the left's arguments, the concept that the European Economic Community is a capitalist plot much harder to ignore in terms of framing this conversation. Worth noting that this was it's quite, because by this point, Roy Jenkins had been in the cabinet, because he had been Home Secretary. So it carried a lot of weight, didn't it? Yeah.
He's a big figure. He becomes Home Secretary in the Labour government. So Labour government comes in 1964, and there's quite a lot of optimism to it.
Quite a reforming Home Secretary as well.
The white heat of technology is the famous speech by Howard Wilson that's often replayed.
Would you like me to do the impression?
You can if you want. I don't know. Never, maybe.
Yeah, look, I'm good. I'll talk to you with Thatcher when she comes up.
So the Labour Party, they come in with a national plan. They're going to regenerate the economy and so on, and things don't go so well. Callaghan becomes the Chancellor, and he ends up devaluing the pound, and the sort of massive economic growth that they were sort of hoping and promising for doesn't happen. Jenkins is Home Secretary, and obviously he oversees a whole series of liberal reforms as Home Secretary. A lot of them come from backbench MPs or from the Lords, but you see this whole series of liberal reforms. So you see the legalisation of abortion, homosexuality, of the ending of a lot of the theatre censorship, and various reforms that are brought in by the government. He then becomes Chancellor of the Exchequer after Callaghan has to step down because of the devaluation. It's felt that Callaghan can't carry on as Chancellor, so Roy Jenkins becomes Chancellor, and he's generally seen as having been a great success. So in what was a government that people were quite disillusioned with, both in terms of the social reforms he brings in as Home Secretary and the stewardship of the economy after Callaghan has to move and stop being Chancellor, he seems to have been one of the successes of a government that's otherwise not generally seen as being particularly successful. So his stock in the late 60s is quite high, and there is a lot of talk about should he challenge Wilson for the leadership, hence the quote, but he never does. And obviously we don't know what would have happened if he had challenged him.
I suppose this is where a deeper story begins to develop when it comes to the history of the SDP. I suppose really this is sort of shows the beginnings of this sort of this emergence. And I suppose really this adds another layer to the story. I suppose really because we are covering the Labour Party, but this is I'm trying to understand the birth of the SDP EP, and I think much of it begins from Roy Jenkins' time as Chancellor. He had already made his name and made a name for himself as a reforming Home Secretary, and now as Chancellor, after the trauma of the devaluation of the pound, which tends to scar governments from the times of old, he managed to stabilise the economy, Roy Jenkins, and his kind of orthodox chancellorship, his stewardship as Chancellor, he took some very tough decisions on public spending and interest rates, but things began to become relatively stable. And his small C conservative approach, despite his relatively short time in the Treasury, did manage to establish a reputation that would be called by later chancellors as prudence, and it's one that a Labour government needs to acquire, that reputation, because it was a reputation, that lack of prudence, that always casted a long shadow for Labour governments. And you could argue that this was one of the roots of the SDP mentality of economic responsibility, social justice, and scepticism, a healthy cynicism of tribal dogma and polarization of politics, and this idea of I guess like a free for all. But it equally also carried a double-edged sword, because it gave Labour credibility, but because he wasn't a bit more freer with the money and he limited that freedom to spend, many people argued that many people point to Roy Jenkins and that prudence as the reason for costing them the election. And I think in irony, it was one that Jenkins himself ended up personally taking the damage for it when Wilson replaced him as Chancellor. Well, replaced him as Shadow Chancellor after the 97. And I think by then it understandably left him quite furious, and only deepened his alienation of the leadership in his eyes, of sacrificing a long-term plan for short-term party management. And I think in many ways that sense of frustration is exactly the emotional and ideological soil which sort of gave roots for the SDP to eventually grow. And is it fair to say that a lot of it came from others? he was not the plotter in this case. Unlike so many people who have ambitions, who want to be leader, he was actually quite reluctant to want to challenge Howard Wilson. So I think it shows a level of loyalty, I suppose, which obviously becomes tested as we start to go on in the 70s with the industrial unrest, more divisions and divides, and etc. So I think would that be a fair assessment to make, that a lot of it came from people who rallied around Roy Jenkins rather than Roy Jenkins himself?
Yeah, I think the general view was he would like to have been prime minister, but he wasn't prepared to sort of go and sort of stab someone to get it, you know. But there were others who were keen. There was still, I think, a lot of the sort of Gateskites still resented Howard Wilson, and a lot of them perhaps were sort of encouraging Roy Jenkins, and there was still some on the right who were not happy with him because they saw him as being somebody who'd been disloyal to Gateskill when he was leader. But generally speaking, he's seen a success as
Good
in
Chancellor.
the government.
Yeah.
Although obviously they then lose power in 1970, and he then becomes someone who is detached from most Labour Party opinion, because most of the Labour Party is for leaving, for not joining the European Common Market. And obviously he's seen to rebel against the leadership. And he does end up resigning the deputy leadership of the Labour Party in 1972. This is because after the decision to enter, Tony Benn, in a rare sort of success, manages to actually persuade Howard Wilson that it's a good idea to have a referendum on common market membership. So Labour Party becomes committed that if they come to power, they will have a referendum on common market membership. And it's not certain what would happen then, because generally speaking, most of the time the polls were, people were very sceptical about joining. So there was a fear that if there was a referendum, he might actually have gone no. And so Jenkins was pretty furious about this. So he resigns from the shadow cabinet as deputy leader, and also George Thompson and Harold Lever resign. In fact, David Owen and Dick Taverne, who's another name we may mention about this sort of road to the SDP, also resigns over it as well.
And this is a sign that of the Labour Party, through party activists and through their membership, that is acting in a very puritanical, absolutist and factional fashion. And we see now, I'm just going to break Godwin's law here, but we see now that whenever a government does any sort of measure at all, the public will go, "Oh, this is becoming like Hitler." So it's not uncommon. It's not an uncommon theme that whenever we see conflicts or tensions, and people want to do reform, that it's not uncommon to approach that with a sort of with hyperbole, suspicion, and sort of deep skepticism and I guess exaggeration, really. And I suppose in relation to Dennis Healey and other sort of big personalities, it was a split and conflict within Labour ranks to form some kind of social democratic party that was almost inevitable given the personality of Dennis Healey, and I suppose other players who perhaps acted in too much good faith. In some ways, there was a recognition of Labour needing its trade union members, needing its activists, needing its aspirational working class, the intellectuals, the technocrats, the well-heeled, the industrialists, and to democratise. A good analogy would be, I guess it's like letting a mad raving dog who is on a leash and he ends up biting someone, so you have to pull back on its leash. But eventually that leash gets longer and longer until it's completely out of control. And in that sense, suppose the long leash that keeps getting extended and is losing control was Labour's trade union members, the trade unions themselves, and the activist left. And with each outburst, it starts to go towards one direction. The Bennites were beginning to mobilise within the Labour Party, and that they were beginning to actually force through policies and motions which sat quite uncomfortably for the Hugh Jenkinites, the right of the Labour Party. I mean, I read it. I can't remember where I read it, but I think didn't they pass a motion that they were going to nationalise the top 100 companies, and one of them was apparently Marks and Spencer's.
There was a proposal, I think, to nationalise the top 25 companies that the left pushed through in the early 70s. There's always a left and right within the Labour Party, but often what ignites the left is if they have a charismatic figure that can really mobilise them and lead them, because the left is often quite strong in terms of party activists, but it often doesn't have a lot of the leading figures within the party and somebody who can mobilise that feeling in the country. The parliamentary party is often always dominated by moderates. What you have in the 50s was Nye Bevan, who emerges as this great hero of the left wing of the Labour Party. So you have this clash between the Bevanites and the Gateskites. And then you have the emergence of Tony Benn. Now, Tony Benn starts off as a Labour MP, elected first way back in about 1950-51. He starts off as quite a sort of modernising figure, seen as this great sort of technology nerd enthusiast. He's not seen as being particularly factional. 8 School lets him run all the party political broadcasts in 1959. He's seen as this sort of modern figure. He doesn't really turn left until sort of the early 70s, when suddenly he becomes radicalised. I think he said he first read Marx when he was about 45 and suddenly realised he was right all along. So, or as Harold Wilson said, he immatures with age, instead of Tony Benn.
The wine joke, isn't it? Unlike red wine, immatures with age.
He moves left, and he's clearly a charismatic figure. I mean, if you watch his speeches, and you can still see some of them on YouTube, he's clearly a very good orator, and obviously him, Enoch Powell, Michael Foot are probably the great orators of the 70s. And so he can mobilise an audience, and, he does get a following in the country, to a lesser degree within the parliamentary party. So he's part of the factionalism within the Labour Party. But Roy Jenkins and the Jenkinsites are becoming a minority, because also on things like Europe, a lot of the centre of the Labour Party and even some of the right-wingers are either not in favour of joining or don't feel strongly enough about it to sort of rebel about it. So by then, there's already that factionalism happening in the Labour Party.
And the fact that he did not take up the call to challenge Harold Wilson for his job suggests to me he was already beginning to see the difficulties and how troubling it would be being a Labour leader at this time. And I suppose really he probably saw it as a bit of a dead horse by this point, or a poisoned chalice, seeing how much it aged Wilson, how tired Wilson was looking, and just the sort of the mad mental gymnastics Wilson had to do just by balancing his cabinet in order to prevent further disunity. And I think really that only aided into figures like Roy Jenkins' own mind of just how unworkable it would be trying to recover a party being this divided. And by this point, Jenkins' own liberal social democracy no longer felt like it had a place within the Labour Party by the 70s, and I imagine unleashed this public appetite and hunger to want to correct or to sort of voice his own dissident, by which he would channel through by becoming president of the European Commission when he was asked to take on this. And particularly for Roy Jenkins, this really began to slam the brakes of his idea of liberal social democracy within the Labour Party. And I imagine it was a moment where he felt that there was no future, or it had no worth trying to fight those battles within the Labour Party. Of course, I think it probably will aid the conversation if we think of the psychology that was probably going through Roy's mind and reminding herself of the this once being tested within. I mean, this was not the first time that that the Labour Party had tried to reform itself, and this was, of course, tested with the leadership of his great admirer, Hugh Gaitskell. So I also think it's worth noting, getting into the head of Roy Jenkins with that hindsight and with that information. And going into this period with that knowledge, you can see how it creates, I think, two lines of thinking. The first being that he saw Labour as being hopelessly captured by dogma, self-interest, ideological purity, internal divisions. Historians often credit Howard Wilson's success as being he kept the Labour Party together, which I actually think is a very fair assessment. I think he often played on both sides, because I think you hinted at earlier that he was elected as a kind of left-wing candidate, but ended up being more of a technocrat. You know, like he used to say, modernising white heat of this technology, which can appeal to both the left and the right. But I think it's no exaggeration that the sort of the divisions and fractions was really beginning to heat up by the sort of 1970s. And I think maybe as well, so maybe it might be good at this point to sort of describe what Britain was going through by the 1970s.
So I think in terms of the politics of the 1970s, there's a lot of negativity in Britain about 1970s. There's a feeling there's a lot of problems with strikes and industrial militancy. There's a feeling that there's a lot of problems with a lack of growth in the economy. And generally speaking, there's just a sort of negative feeling about it. There's various attempts to try and deal with the problems of trade union militancy and strikes. Barbara Castle in the 60s tries to bring in place of strife from within the Labour Party, to bring in a system to try and reduce the amounts of strikes, but that's thwarted by various people within the Labour Party that oppose her over that. Ted Heath tries to bring in an Industrial Relations Act in the early 70s, but that again doesn't really succeed. And there's a miners' strike at Saltley Gates where Ted Heath and the local police say that the Saltley Heath works will be kept open at all costs. And then after Scargill and the miners managed to close down the works, and it's seen as this great triumph of the sort of miners over the democratically elected government. And there's a feeling, the government just can't run things. And obviously later on in the 70s, you get things like the winter of discontent and the massive sort of industrial militancy.
Which gloomy times.
Indeed, brings a lot of disillusionment and helps later on bring in Margaret Thatcher on a
inflation. Program. Yeah.
Well, it's said that when Jim Callaghan was PM, he sort of said to his wife, if he was a young man, he'd go and live abroad in Australia now. So, if he as a Prime Minister was saying that, he shouldn't be talking up the country, what would anyone else think about it? So it's a time where people are quite depressed. I think there had been a lot of optimism when the Labour government had come in 1964 that it would bring about sort of modern dynamic Britain. We'd become a high growth, successful country. Perhaps hadn't quite patterned out that way, and it led to a lot of disillusionment. And it leads to the breakdown of that sort of post-war consensus.
Yeah, and they go into 74 with this kind of, I guess, middling, we'll have a social contract with the unions. And I think instead of, union before, they promised in 74, right, we're going to get rid of Heath's industrial relations acts, but we will have a social contract with the unions because we've naturally got a relationship between unions and the Labour Party. We're joined to the hip. So they sort of go in, they're going to promise all, better health and safety laws, more benefits, whatever. And then I think for a time, that did sort of work, but then came the sort of energy crisis, which saw the sort of Arab states blockade oil in response to Israel. Obviously, that becomes that then burns, that feeds fuel and the fire to industrial unrest. And I think there was a sense by, like, was there a sense by some on the right that, we probably, there was a sense from people on the sort of right or the centre of the Labour Party that we aren't really addressing the systemic problems when it comes to inflation and sort of balance of pay and stuff like that. Would that be fair?
Yeah, well, I think the general feeling was that the Labour right had been running the governments of the 60s and then the 70s. And because it doesn't really deliver in a way that sort of provokes a lot of the left wing of the Labour Party into believing that it was a failed government and that they never really tried socialism. Obviously, a lot of the more radical policies within the Labour Party are basically sort of quietly dropped by the Labour government in the 60s and 70s. And there's just a general feeling that nothing really works at the time. The Heath government came in 1970. He was going to change things as well. There was Selsdon Man. There was this idea there'd be a new way of running the economy and things, and it doesn't succeed either. So there's just a general feeling that things aren't going very well. Or as Jimmy Carter said in the American context, there was a malaise. He says when he's president of America, which goes through similar things. There's inflation. There's the lack of growth.
If you watch his Oval Office speeches and compare them to Edward Heath's Christmas speech, it makes Edward Heath's the famous Christmas speech, "This will be the toughest Christmas ever." Jimmy Carter makes Edward Heath's speech sound like gold. So God, he was so pessimistic and.
Yes. So there's just a general feeling that consensus is breaking down and that the old parties aren't succeeding. Now, in a sense, we did sort of start by saying we've got this two-party system and Labour and the Tories sort of dominate from the 20s onwards.
A question.
Yeah, but during this period, you've got the Liberal Party, which is still carrying on. So in the Liberal Party goes into a decline in the 30s, 40s, 50s. By the early to mid-50s, it's down to 2.5% of the vote. But as things aren't seen to be delivered by the other parties, you do see a movement towards the Liberal Party generally over the sort of late 50s, 60s, 70s. So 1958, you have the Liberals gaining the Torrington by-election. Then 59, they got to 6% of the vote. 62, you have the famous Orpington by-election that the Liberals gained from the Conservatives. And then in 1964, you have the party go up to 11% of the vote. And then in 74, you have a series of by-elections in 72, 73, the Isle of Ely, Eric-on-Tweed and others that the party gains. And then in 74, they get 19% of the vote in the February election. So you see this general rise in Liberal support, and there's this sort of waves of gradually the party increases its vote as time goes on. And a lot of that, I think, is to do with the sort of breakdown in people's confidence with the two main parties, because there is a time in sort of 950, 951 where you have the biggest turnouts ever in general elections, over 80%, and sort of 95% of people are voting Labour or Conservative. But that breaks down, and that also obviously contributes towards the formation of the SDP, because when the breakaway does come from the Labour Party, there is a sort of partly revived Liberal Party that they can sort of attach themselves to make themselves a stronger third force. Within the Labour Party, there's a lot of factionalism going on. The left wing of the Labour Party, generally feels that it's been very let down by the governments. They haven't delivered socialism. They've not delivered, sort of mass nationalisation of industry. They haven't.
They haven't nationalised Marks and Spencer's.
Well, indeed. Europe is obviously one of the big clash points, and you have in 1973 the Labour MP for Lincoln, Dick Taverne, is deselected by his constituency party. They decide that they will basically sack him as the MP because he's in favour of joining Europe, and they didn't agree with him breaking the party whip. So he resigns and causes a by-election, runs as Democratic Labour and wins very easily.
And then after that, I think they then get the referendum. And I think maybe explain that, because that was one where I think Howard Wilson played a very kind of tactical role. I think he wanted to not make it be a vote on him. And I think that probably, I think you might have already mentioned it, Michael, but I think that also contributed towards the adding fuel to the fire from the radical left of Labour.
Yeah, so Taverne, as well as voting for EC membership, resigns from the junior front bench role because he's opposed to this policy of a referendum. And this is when Roy Jenkins also resigns from the front bench of the Labour Party. And it's generally thought that whereas in the late 60s, he'd been like he was basically one of the favourites to replace Hal Wilson. By the early 70s, because he's so out of step on things like Europe, it's generally felt that when the leadership election happens, he's not going to get it because he's too much out of step with a lot of the party.
Yeah. Right, let's sort of move forward to so we've sort of painted a picture of the Labour Party, disarray, fractions, splits. 70s, this sort of the feeling of malaise. We have the IMF. So the IMF bailout, which is seen as a great humiliation for the left. Again, people like Tony Benn, they lead that and say this is humiliating. We're sort of groveling to these big, capitalist financial institutions, and it's just seen as a great humiliation. I think it's sort of price controls start coming in to try and control inflation, and then we also get we get the austerity of budget constraints that is enacted by Dennis Healey, which makes himself quite unpopular, although I would argue that no chancellor is popular. I think you find it very hard to find a popular chancellor. I think probably Gordon Brown's probably the closest one that we've ever had to a popular chancellor, but there we go. And all this just sort of gives the lasting impression of decline, Britain's decline economically, its role in the world, and some malaise. Callaghan, he then loses a motion of confidence from Parliament by one vote. We go into the election of 1979, and we then get to the 1979 election, and Mrs. Thatcher wins that. So what does that begin to do in politics? Where is Labour at this point, Michael?
It's factionalism that's been going on within the Labour Party between the win in 74 and the defeat in 79.
Yeah.
The left wing of the Labour Party becomes more and more organised. There's various grassroots organisations within the Labour Party, like the Campaign for Labour Party Democracy, which is basically arguing that more power should be given to the grassroots activists, who also happen to be generally more on the left. So they're arguing to think.
Explaining the leadership. I'll just put that as a mental note. Might be worth explaining the leadership election, because that'll obviously come.
Yeah, I'm going to bring that in the 76 one.
Yeah, awesome.
So you see the Labour Party left wing organising in Parliament with a Tribune group that's often leading some of the rebellions against the 74-79 Labour government. Is also organising at the grassroots. Campaign for Labour Party Democracy is basically arguing for an internal democracy, but it's basically an activist democracy. It's not sort of arguing for one member, one vote of all party members. It's basically trying to create a situation where the most active sort of 40, 50 members of the Labour Party in each constituency have a lot more power, who also generally tend to be the more left-wing members, with the sort of general management committees of Labour.
College, in a way.
Sorry?
Almost like an electoral college.
Yeah, well, there is an electoral college later, but so their arguments are that the Labour MP should no longer have the sole right to vote for the leader, that votes should be given to the trade unions and to party activists as well. And they also want to bring in mandatory reselection of MPs, which is controversial. So you see the defection of Taverne in 73, but that's because of his opposition to the party line on Europe, because he's in favour of joining Europe. But that's a rarity. But this is a group of activists who are basically saying that every Labour MP should have to face reselection. And of course, if you're a right-of-centre MP whose local activists are very left-wing, that has potentials for them to be deselected. And the left wing of the party is already pushing within the party for a movement of policy on other issues, on defence and the economy and so on, to a more leftward position. So you see a reaction against this from the right wing of the Labour Party. They form a group called the Manifesto Group in Parliament, and Bill Rogers in 1977, going to go on to be one of the founders of the SDP, he forms a grassroots right-wing organisation, Campaign for Labour Victory, a lot of whose members, the MPs and councillors, go on to form the basis of the SDP. But basically, these are pushing against the leftward trend in the party. 1976, you have a Labour leadership election after Harold Wilson retires. So despite all the paranoia that he might be removed, he actually survives as leader from 63 to 76 without facing any leadership challenge. He goes of his own accord in 1976. You get 6 people that stand for this election. Arguably, it's perhaps the most talented group of people to ever stood in one leadership election. But it also, in the 6 personalities, sets out just what a factional party the Labour Party is by 1976 and how difficult it is to contain all these different strands of opinion.
Not sure if you can list them all, but would you say...
Yeah, well, I was about to go through them. Yeah. So if we start from left...
what was
people the leadership election in 1976?
Yeah, we've got a few technical difficulties. So we've got Labour trying to democratise itself from the left, his reselection. This creates a rift from both those on the right. They form the manifesto group. And we now go into a leadership election.
So 1976 Labour Party leadership election, arguably, it probably got the most talented range of people to stand in a contest, but it also shows the deep ideological divisions within the Labour Party and how all these people with different views are being kept in one party and the tensions that causes. So if you look at the 6 candidates, you've got Tony Benn standing as the sort of candidate of the radical left. He's quite popular in the constituencies, but less popular within the parliamentary Labour Party. So he's going to face a challenge trying to win. You've then got Michael Foot, who had a long career in the Labour Party as a sort of outsider. First stands for Parliament in 1935, first gets elected in 1945, but doesn't become a minister in the Labour government until 1974. Whereas Tony Benn has been an insider who's sort of turned left and more radical, Michael Foot was more of an outsider who's become much more loyal more recently in the run-up to 76. You've then got Jim Callaghan standing, who's seen as being sort of on the right, but sort of quite closely associated with the trade unions. He helped bring down Barbara Castle's attempts to limit the powers of the trade unions in the 1960s to in place of strife. Also quite socially conservative. You've then got Tony Crosland, who's a sort of intellectual on the right of the party, who wrote The Future of Socialism, which was basically an argument the Labour Party should spend less time talking about nationalisation of industry and more concentrating on equality. You've then got Dennis Healey, who's another figure from the right of the Labour Party, who's Chancellor. He's obviously made himself not terribly popular with a lot of the left-wing activists because as Chancellor of the Exchequer, he hasn't been pursuing particularly radical left-wing policies that they'd like him to. And then you've got Roy Jenkins standing as the sort of candidate of the liberal right, very sort of pro-European. And so you have this contest with these 6 very substantial figures, all with different views. In the end, Jim Callaghan ends up winning. Michael Foot finishes second. Jenkins finishes third. He gets 56 votes on the first round, but drops out. I think he's quite disappointed. He'd been the front runner at one point, but in the end, he doesn't really make it. And I suspect there's a combination of political differences where he is pushing for EEC membership very strongly when there's a lot of Eurosceptics within the Labour Party still. And on the economy, he's set his face against nationalisation. He's delivered sort of comments and speeches about avoiding public spending getting too high. So he's very much detached himself from a lot of the Labour Party at the time, which is quite Eurosceptic, but also quite in favour of state intervention on the economy. So he's out of step politically with a lot of people. There's also a sort of cultural, sort of personality-based criticism of him as well. So he's seen as somebody who is a member of a lot of gentlemen's clubs in London. He's friends with a lot of sort of moderate conservatives on the sort of moderate wing of the party, the sort of Ian Gilmore type figures. In quite a tribal party like Labour, it's not terribly looked well upon by a lot of members to hang around with Tories, even very moderate ones. And he's obviously there's the whole thing about claret and liking fine wine and fine foods. And he's generally seen as being sort of patrician, slightly superior figure. Ironically, because actually he comes from quite a working class background. His father Arthur Jenkins was a Labour MP. He was also a trade union organiser for the NUM. He was actually arrested during one dispute between the police and the miners back in the 20s. But even though he comes from quite a sort of Labour background, he's not really seen as a Labour figure. He's seen as this sort of slightly posh, perhaps sort of slightly out of touch figure. There's a story from the time that some of his supporters in the Parliamentary Labour Party go round canvassing the bars in the House of Commons, and they approach this group of older trade union Labour MPs to ask, are you voting for Roy Jenkins? And one of them allegedly laughs and says, no, lad, we're all Labour here, which, rather suggests that he's seen as being sort of outside of the party mainstream. So there is, I think, sort of a combination of the fact that he doesn't quite culturally fit in with a lot of the Labour Party, and ideologically, he's obviously fell out with a lot of the left wing of the party. He gets 56 votes, but it means he comes third. Tony Benn, I think, gets 37 votes. He gets 30, and Crosland gets 17, and Michael Foot comes second. I think in the final ballot, it's something like 176 to Callaghan, 137 to Michael Foot. Which is a very high vote. In fact, there's talk at the time of, oh my word, are we going to have a left-wing prime minister? But in the end, Callaghan wins and is quite a moderate figure. But at this point, Jenkins then basically decides, I'm not going to become leader of the Labour Party. So he decides to leave and go off to Europe to become president of the European Commission.
European Commission.
He leaves Parliament for that job. And it's seen at the time as if basically it's sort of the ending of his political career in Britain. He's obviously leaving Parliament, and he goes also, David Markand, who was a Labour MP for Ashfield, resigns his seat to go off to work for him in Parliament as well. He's one of the sort of loyal Jenkinsites. So that leads to Roy Jenkins leaving Parliament. And through the rest of the 70s, you have the factionalism within the Labour Party. You see the rise of David Owen. Tony Crosland dies prematurely in 1977. David Owen becomes Foreign Secretary and becomes quite a well-known figure then. And then you have the 79 election when the Labour Party lose. And if the factionalism was bad before the election, it gets really bad in the period after 1979. As somebody says, it's like a party having a nervous breakdown. I think Austin Mitchell, in his book on 4 years of the death of the Labour Party, says he's welcoming some delegates to the Labour Party conference after the 79 election and says, come on in, the blood's lovely, because obviously there's this disputes and fights within the Labour Party because it is so bitter and angry. And post 79 election, the divisions just really ignite within the Labour Party. Roy Jenkins begins to re-emerge after the 79 election. He does his famous Dimbleby lecture in November 1979 when he talks about the possibility of a new force needing to be created within the Labour Party. Although at the time, most of the right-wing Labour MPs sort of took a bit of a distance from him.
I suppose, like, in that sense, the story that we're talking about the SDP really begins with the issue of Europe and Britain's role in the European Economic Community. And it resonated very strongly from people within the Labour right, like David Owen, Bill Rogers, Billy Williams and Roy Jenkins. And I think partly it's because they were it sort of adds to the increasing, just them being fed up of this sort of ugly tribalism within British politics. And I suppose in many ways, I suppose if this episode is to be a demonstration of, or try to, what it's trying to achieve, is that it sort of demonstrates that underlining belief from figures like Roy Jenkins in cross-party liberalism, which is something we'll talk a lot more in episode 2, especially when we go on to discuss the alliance, his relationship with the Liberal Party, Roy Jenkins' relationship with David Steele. And obviously, by episode 2, we'll be looking at opinion polls, because I think me and you, Michael, are in agreement that there's quite a lot of myth-making around that, and the polls would suggest that actually, it's very it's quite lazy to say that the alliance it's stolen votes from Labour people, when actually I think it's a lot more complicated than that. But I think I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself there. But fundamentally, I think these moments show how frustrated many within the Labour Party had become with the tribal politics, particularly when it came to Europe, an issue that has never gone away. And without people like Roy Jenkins and the pro-Europeans, Britain almost certainly would not, or at least it would have been delayed, being able to join the European Economic Community, which in turn would have prevented things might have prevented further developments, like when it came to a political union, Erasmus, freedom of movement, and sort of the wider European, the wider consequences of European integration. I think you are right in terms of the arithmetics. Jenkins and those 69 MPs were very decisive. But I think to sort of clip this, to clip this all together, I think what that really underlines a very deeper point when it comes to Britain's entry into Europe, which was driven by, I guess, cross-party internationalism or cross-party liberalism, which I think is a lot more akin to sort of Roy Jenkins' politics. And I think we begin to see that when he helped joining Jeremy Thorpe in the campaign to vote yes into remaining in the European Union, which I think helped shape his kind of general political thinking. And I think Jenkins himself would later call the radical centre. And it's something you can even see echo in figures like Tony Blair, who I think often viewed Roy Jenkins as something of a role model. So this makes this story a lot less about rebellion and more about the evolving nature of politics and about the attempt to redefine what the progressive left should actually look like. Finally, as a sort of broad reflection, when you look at someone like Roy Jenkins, who as Chancellor was quite economically prudent and even a little bit austere when it came to his approach to the public finances, you could see how he embodied this. He really embodied things that would have really sat quite uncomfortably for the Bennites and people on the left, and in turn, it made it much harder for part of the Labour left to maintain the idea that Europe was. It was hard for them to not be able to say it was a capitalist plot when one of the most prominent pro-Europeans was someone on the right of the Labour Party, and I think only added to the internal frictions and tensions that was already pulling within the seams of the Labour Party. So we get this period after 1979. Jim Callaghan carries on for another year. Then that then triggers a Labour leadership election. And I suppose to sort of really add to the complexity of this is that if you're someone on the left of the Labour Party, you might be quite cynical and say, look, we tried it your way. It didn't work. It lost us the election. We need to democratise the party more. And I suppose for them, really, that becomes ammunition for them to sort of, to sort of paint themselves as kind of the sort of change candidates, really, which then makes those on like people like Roy Jenkins and you mentioned David Owen getting quite nervous about the direction that they're going. So perhaps if you can, as I alluded to earlier, by mentioning a certain someone who has a fashion for ill-fitted jackets, maybe you can explain what happens when Jim Callaghan resigns as leader and what the outcome ends up being.
Okay, so you've got within the Labour Party after 1979 basically the beginnings of a civil war in the Labour Party between the left and the right. You've got the left, which begins to mobilise in terms of wanting to take over Labour Party policy, Labour Party structure and Labour Party leadership. So you see a move to the left in Labour Party policy. There's a big criticism that the Labour Party in 1979 excluded from its manifesto all the sort of radical and left-wing policies, and this betrayal is why the Labour Party failed to win that election. You see immediately after the 79 election, the conference is beginning to move to the left. You see a special Labour Party conference in May 1980 at Wembley called Peace, Jobs and Freedom. This passes a series of left-wing policies. The Labour Party becomes committed to unilateral nuclear disarmament. It becomes committed to import controls and nationalisation and various other policies that are moving the party to the left on policy terms. Then in terms of the organisation of the party, you begin to see again in the conferences in 79-80, motions beginning to be passed in favour of things like changing the leadership methods of the Labour Party. Up till now, it's controlled by MPs, but the left wing want to get the trade unions and constituency party activists involved because they think that will make it more likely that a left-wing candidate will be elected. And also there's the leadership as well, because Jim Callaghan is likely to be stepping down. He's lost the election. He's getting a lot of internal criticisms. In the conferences after the 79 election, there's a lot of vituperative attacks upon him, blaming him for losing the election, even though actually when you look at the polls in the 79 election, the one thing that's going for the Labour Party is that Jim Callaghan has very high approval ratings personally. He was more popular than Mark by quite a measure, and you can argue that actually if somebody else had been leader of the Labour Party, they'd probably lost by a bigger margin, because his popularity is one of the things that is keeping the Labour Party vote still up at a reasonable level in 1979. So there's this move to the left in the Labour Party, and obviously you then see a similar move to the right within the Labour Party. And in terms of the formation of the SDP, you've basically got two sets of people that are coming together that eventually form the SDP. The first is Roy Jenkins and the Jenkinsites. Roy Jenkins, by now, after having been president of the European Commission, has basically cut his ties with the Labour Party, really. He doesn't even vote Labour at the 1979 election. He's off in Europe. When he comes back, he starts meeting with various former Labour MPs and talks about perhaps re-entering politics, either in a new organisation, as he sort of floats in his Dimbleby lecture in 1979 when he talks about the need to sort of break the mould of politics and bring in a new political force, or possibly joining the Liberal Party. He does have conversations with David Steele around this time when he basically says, he would be considering joining the Liberal Party. But Steele's view is that actually a few people and Roy Jenkins joining the Liberal Party is not going to make as big an impact as a big break away from the Labour Party, forming a new party that can then go in alliance with the Liberal Party. So he sort of dissuades Jenkins and anyone else who asks to defect from doing so. And so what you see then, so you see that group, the Roy Jenkins group, which is sort of outside Parliament, and then you've got the gang of three begin to form. So David Owen, Shirley Williams, and Bill Rogers. David Owen and Bill Rogers are both within Parliament at this time, within the shadow cabinet. Shirley Williams has lost her seat in Stevenage at the 1979 election, but she's still active with it. Unlike Jenkins, she's still very active within the Labour Party because she does have a seat on Labour's National Executive Committee. Now, Labour's National Executive Committee, which basically runs the Labour Party at the time, is absolutely dominated by the left wing of the party, and so Shirley Williams is in a small minority within the National Executive Committee in being on the sort of right wing of the party. And basically, in June 1980, John Silkin, who is one of the Labour shadow cabinet members, who's anti-EU, declares the Labour Party should come out in favour of withdrawal from the EC without a referendum. Now, bearing in mind the last Labour government had a referendum and it was 2-1 for staying in the European community, this causes a bit of fury and anger amongst Bill Rogers and David Owen and other pro-EC MPs, because it's like, well, we had the vote, it was 2-1 for staying in, why are you wanting to reverse that decision? And so in June 1980, Owen and Rogers and Williams do publish a statement in the press which basically alludes to the fact that they're very inclined to leave the Labour Party if it declares itself for withdrawal from the European community. They then continue with that, with writing an open letter to members of the Labour Party in August, basically repeating this again, that if the Labour Party move to the left keeps going, then they will leave. That then gets us to the Labour Party conference at Blackpool in 1980, when you have the changes to the leadership of the method of electing the leader of the Labour Party, which get pushed through the conference. So there's going to be an electoral college that will vote for the leader of the Labour Party. So the Labour Party will lose, basically Labour MPs will lose their monopoly on electing the leader of the party. And this is being pushed by the left because they believe that if you can get party activists voting in the leadership elections, it will mean that a left-wing candidate's more likely to be elected. Whereas if you leave it with the MPs, it's more likely to be a right candidate's elected. So at that conference, the left basically win everything. They manage to get the principle passed that there should be an electoral college. They push through the policies on unilateral nuclear disarmament, withdraw from the European community, the sort of import controls, and basically all these sort of left-wing policies that the Social Democrats don't agree with. At this point, Jim Callaghan, absolutely fed up, decides he wants to resign as leader of the Labour Party. But he's also doing this because if he resigns immediately at the time of the conference, before an electoral college has been the method of the electoral college in terms of who gets to vote in it and what share of the vote they all get, a leadership election will be on the old rules, which is MPs only. So, and his view is if he goes now, he can get his favourite candidate, the right winger Dennis Healey, elected as leader. So Callaghan goes now and provokes a leadership election in November 1980, which will be fought on the old rules, which is MPs only. Tony Benn's furious because obviously he sees there's no way the Parliamentary Labour Party is going to elect him as leader of the Labour Party. He says, you should wait till the Electoral College is formed and have it as an electoral college because he knows he'll do better with the party activists. But the leadership election happens. There are 4 candidates: Michael Foot, Dennis Healey, Peter Shaw and John Silkin. Now, initially, Michael Foot decides he doesn't really want to stand for leader of the Labour Party. He's a very intelligent academic man. When Callaghan announces his resignation, I think he's in Ireland doing a talk on Jonathan Swift. And if you ever see interviews with Michael Foot, he'll often sort of talk about Lord Byron and Jonathan Swift and all these other sort of literary figures.
Yeah, very cultured. Yeah.
He's a very intelligent man.
Not unlike Roy Jenkins in a lot of ways, ironically.
Yes, although not quite as obsessed with his appearance, probably. He sort of I think he breaks his glasses.
As we'll come to in episode 2.
And then he ends up as leader of the Labour Party with his glasses tied together with masking tape, I think, at one point after he breaks them and sort of spends weeks wandering around with his broken glasses. But there's a leadership election and it's generally assumed that Dennis Healey will win. Michael Foot gets persuaded, I think, by Neil Kinnock and by his wife, Jill Craigie, to stand. So he does stand for leader of the party. It's generally thought Dennis Healey will win.
It needs to be noted that he was considered, which I think you're going to allude to, he was actually considered the compromise candidate.
Yes.
Despite being on the left of the Labour Party.
Yeah, so Michael Foot had been a radical MP in the 40s and 50s. He'd been very closely associated with Nyron Bevan, who was his political hero. He was a great critic of Hugh Gates' schools. He regularly rebels against the party. He's a massive supporter of unilateral nuclear disarmament. From most of post-war Labour history, that's a minority position within the party. He goes on sort of Aldermaston marches, ban the bomb, anti-nuclear weapons campaigner. So he's very much on the left wing of the party, but he eventually gets brought into the Wilson-Callaghan government 74 to 79. In fact, 76 to 79, he gets brought in as leader of the House. And it ends up being a post that really does suit him. He's good at oratory, and that part of the job does suit him. Labour Party government has no majority by 76 to 79 because it's lost some seats through by-elections and defections, so it's struggling. But for those 3 years, it survives in office, and he famously does a speech during the no confidence vote in 1979, which goes down very well with the MPs. So he's seen as somebody who did a good job in the Labour government of 74, 79, keeping it together. And he's seen by now as being a more moderate figure in that he's sort of divorced himself from Tony Benn by now. He's sort of doesn't think that this sort of radical activist behaviour, challenging MPs, mandatory reselection is a particularly wise thing to be doing. So he is by now a bit of a compromise candidate, even though he is politically clearly from the left of the Labour Party. It's generally thought Dennis Healey will win. Yeah. The Social Democrats within the Parliamentary Labour Party do lobby him, and he has a meeting with people like Mike Thomas and other Labour MPs who end up joining the SDP. And they go and see Dennis Healey during the leadership election in 1980. And they basically say, why won't you take a more stronger position in favour of the right wing of the Labour Party? Why won't you up the left wing activists more strongly? Why won't you come out more strongly against mandatory reselection and against the various left wing drift? And he basically says, I need to win over the moderate MPs who just want a quiet life and don't want rows. You have nowhere else to go. You have to vote for me, which in a sense they do. Although Mike Thomas then says when he joins the forms the SDP, he thought about sending, this is how long ago it was, sending a telegram to Dennis Healey saying found somewhere else to go when he forms the SDP. But it's interesting that there's sort of echoes there of New Labour in that I remember in the early years of New Labour in the 1990s and 2000s, if anyone sort of complained within the Labour Party that New Labour was too right wing, they'd sort of say, we've nowhere else to go. And of course, these days people do have places outside the Labour Party to go in terms of the Greens, your party and whatever, if you're on the left wing of the Labour Party. But Healey ends up narrowly losing. He wins the first round. I think he gets 112, Hook gets 83, and then Silkin and Shaw get about 38 and 30. But then on the second round, Michael Foot gets most of Silkin and Shaw's votes, and he gets 139 to Dennis Healey's 129, and Michael Foot becomes leader of the Labour Party, which comes as a bit of a shock to the sort of right-wing Social Democrats because he's very anti-market. He was one of the 7 cabinet ministers that argued for leaving the European Community in the 75 referendum. He's a long-term opponent of nuclear weapons. And so they're a bit despairing, really, the Owens, the Jenkins, the Williams, that this man's taken over the Labour Party because he does hold a lot of policy positions which are very different to theirs.
How much did Dennis Healey's personality handicap him? Because I hear stories that even though he was a great family man, he was quite unpleasant to work with in Labour Party politics. And I don't know if I'm getting ahead of myself on this comment. I don't know if it was the deputy leadership, but is there a conspiracy that some Social Democrats voted for Michael Foot, or am I getting a bit ahead of myself?
So 2 questions on that one. So Dennis Healey's personality. Joe Ashton, who's a Labour MP, said, if you want to be a successful leader of the Labour Party, you need to spread BS. Basically, if somebody comes up to you with a really dumb idea that's really stupid, what you need to do is smile at them and say, that's a really interesting idea. I'd never thought of that before. I'll have a think about it. And then obviously forget about the idea. But Dennis Healey wouldn't do that. If somebody came up to him with a dumb idea, he'd say that's an effing stupid idea, which is commendable honesty. But if you're trying to get MPs who probably more than the average person have quite a sense of sort of their own sort of importance, if you then go around telling them they're effing stupid, it's probably going to make them less likely to vote for you when you need their votes in a leadership election. So it's said that his sort of style of dealing with people, which could be very rough, probably did alienate a lot of people. So that probably lost him votes. The other part, which you'll rightly allude to, is that there were a number of Labour MPs who, by the end of 1980, when you'd had these policy changes on nuclear weapons in Europe, were going to leave the Labour Party. But it still wasn't entirely certain that people like Shirley Williams were going to leave the Labour Party, or even Bill Rogers was going to leave the Labour Party. So some of the sort of backbench Labour MPs who really wanted a split and had decided they were going to leave the Labour Party thought that the only way they could guarantee that was if Michael Foot became leader of the Labour Party. That if Dennis Healey became leader of the Labour Party, because he was sort of a figure that was seen on being on the right, people like Shirley Williams and probably Bill Rogers would have stayed in the party. Ivor Crewe and Anthony King, who did the history of the SDP book, wrote to all the former SDP MPs and said to them, how did you vote in the 1980 leadership election? And they said they got replies from most of them. And they said most of them replied and said, well, there's an obvious question. Why are you asking me? I voted for Dennis Healey. Of course, he shared most of my political views. But he did say that 5 of them wrote back and said they voted for Michael Foot, basically because they decided they were going to leave the Labour Party.
Oh, wow.
Therefore, they were going to,
Fascinating.
and Foot wins by 10 over Dennis Healey. Now, if these are 5 MPs from the right who you'd assume would vote for Healey, not Foot, if they voted for Foot deliberately to land the Labour Party with a left-wing unpopular leader, 5 votes off Healey, 5 extra on Foot makes the 10. They also argue in the book that they believe there was a 6th. This person didn't admit it to them, but they believe that there was a 6th MP who also voted for Michael Foot deliberately to land it with an unpopular. And if that is true, then that would have made the difference. Although you can also argue that maybe if Dennis Healey had been more friendly and amenable to his colleagues, he'd have got a few extra votes as well. So those votes wouldn't have made the difference. But you end up now with a Labour Party leader that's committed to a lot of left-wing policies. And it's at this point, David Owen says he won't serve in the shadow cabinet. And then Shirley Williams says she won't stand as a Labour candidate again in Stevenage because the Labour Party in Stevenage are keen for her to stand again. And she announces shortly after Michael Foot's elected leader, they won't stand again. Roy Jenkins comes back, now getting to 1981, 6th of January, Roy Jenkins comes back to Britain from Brussels, and a week later begins having meetups with the Gang of Three. So you begin at the beginning of January 1981 to have meetings between Roy Jenkins, Shirley Williams, Bill Rogers and David Owen, and they begin to talk about breaking away from the Labour Party. And there's basically a date set that's very specific, which is that there's a Wembley conference on the 24th of January 1981, which is a special conference which is going to decide on this electoral college on how to elect the leader of the party. And they want to go there, and so basically it's a sort of last chance to see what happens within the Labour Party. And Williams and Rogers, they want a system for electing leader of the Labour Party that they're sympathetic to. They go, and they actually try and outflank the left by being more radical in that Owen pushes the idea of one member, one vote within the Labour Party. So basically you would have a system.
The membership voting,
one member, one vote, which is a very radical option, which becomes the SDP's policy. Because obviously most of the political parties had kept their leadership elections with the MPs. Well, in fact, the Conservative Party didn't even give MPs the vote until 1965. Until in 1963, Alec Douglas-Hume emerges as leader of the Conservative Party after, the men in grey suit, magic circle, decide that he's going to be leader. There isn't even a vote. It isn't until 1965 that even MPs get to vote in the Conservative Party. The Labour Party had elected its leader from the Parliamentary Labour Party, up to and including Michael Foot narrowly beating Dennis Healey in October 1980, but it was now committed to this new system. The Liberal Party had a form. It wasn't one member, one vote. It was basically every local assembly. It was a very odd system. That was only basically MPs had elected the Liberal leader as late as 1967 when Thorpe stands against Eric Lubbock and Emlyn Hewson, but there's only 12 Liberal MPs in 1967 and 3 candidates. So when you've got a quarter of the parliamentary party, a quarter of the electorate are also candidates, it seemed a bit ridiculous. So they came up with this very complicated system, which I don't believe was one member, one vote. I think it was some system whereby every local Liberal association was given a certain number of votes allocated depending on A, how many members, but also B, how many votes they'd got at the previous election or something. So it wasn't pure one member, one vote. They used that once in between David Steele and Harder in 76. They don't have one member, one vote.
It was pretty much like
it was a very odd system.
It was like primaries, I suppose, for American audiences. It was like primaries, electoral college. But yeah, you're right. Yeah, it was a very, very unusual system, unique.
They have this
quite radical. They were quite radical. Yeah,
they were quite radical. So the Social Democrats basically decide we're going to go for one member, one vote. Gets nowhere. The unions aren't going to support it. The Labour Party delegates there are Labour Party activists who obviously want the activists to have the vote rather than the ordinary members, because at the time the view was that the Labour Party activists would be quite left-wing, whereas the ordinary members would be more moderate and more likely to support the sort of right of the party. There's lots of arguments. There's various systems that are suggested. In the end, the system that's chosen gives trade unions the largest block of votes. It gives the trade unions 40% of the vote in electing a leader of the Labour Party, and it only gives the MPs 30%, and it gives the party activists 30%. So at this point, the Gang of Four say, no, this is ridiculous. We're going. Shirley Williams says it's no way to run a party, a bunch of trade union bosses deciding the next party leader or prime minister. And it's at this stage they decide definitely they're leaving. And so the day afterwards, on the 25th of January, you get what is called the Limehouse Declaration, which is the Council for Social Democracy, which is launched by Roy Jenkins, David Owen, Bill Rogers, Shirley Williams at David Owen's house in Limehouse, hence East London, hence the Limehouse Declaration. And they basically say that because of the decisions of the Labour Party conference and the move to the left, they can't stay in the Labour Party anymore, and they're going to break away and join and they're going to create a new organisation. At the time, it's generally seen as something that's going to turn into a political party, but at this point it's not a political party, it's just the Council for Social Democracy. And at the time, they're still sitting as effectively Labour MPs, the ones who are MPs. But it's at this point we get to a stage where basically the breakaway has happened. There is this Council for Social Democracy. It has effectively become semi-detached from the Labour Party. You got David Owen, Bill Rogers, Shirley Williams, Roy Jenkins, who are saying, we don't agree with the leader of the Labour Party, Michael Foot. He's too left-wing for us. We don't agree with the policies of the Labour Party. If they get into government, they're going to pursue policies we can't possibly agree with, withdraw from the European community, unilateral nuclear disarmament, closing down all the American bases in the UK, a policy of import-export controls, basically a siege economy, nationalisation of massive amounts of industry, which they don't agree with. And you've got a Labour Party which looks like it's going to be dominated by the left because the parliamentary party's now been marginalised and it's only got 30% of the vote in the leadership election. And the left-wing activists are pushing things like mandatory reselection of MPs, whereby local constituency parties dominated by the left can, if they want to, basically sack Labour MPs that they think are too right-wing. So at this point, they're basically semi-detached from the Labour Party. They form this Council for Social Democracy. A few days later, David Owen tells his constituency party he won't stand as a Labour candidate again in Plymouth. On February the 5th, they take out a big advert in The Guardian called the Declaration of 100, which has a whole series of not just MPs, but also writers, journalists, business people, religious figures, there is one trade unionist as well, various great and good, basically, who signed this Declaration of 100 saying they support the actions of the Campaign for Council for Social Democracy. And at this point, we're in this sort of hiatus whereby this grouping has been formed, but a party hasn't been yet. But on March the 26th, 1981, you see the launch of the Social Democratic Party in the Connaught Rooms in London. But I guess we will leave that stage to the next episode, just to basically say that the formation of the SDP basically comes about because of factionalism and division within the Labour Party over many years. The fact the party is perceived as moving to the left in terms of leadership and policy and organisation of the party. That means that some people just feel that they can't stay in it any longer. And so they leave and they're ready to form a new party, the Social Democratic Party, which will go on to be the biggest challenger to Labour and the Conservatives' rule since the 1920s.
And on that, yes, until next time, we'll see what ends up being for the SDP, especially for the 83 election, which I think proved to be, in a lot of ways, quite consequential for the shape for the country's direction and politics. So, yeah, I think that's a good way to end off, Michael. Right, thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. And in episode 2, we will, like Michael said, look at what happens with the SDP, with this new party, how many from Labour or other parties decide to defect, and also, most importantly, we forget that there was already a third force that Roy Jenkins talked about. What did he do with the Liberal Party? So until then, take care and goodbye.